What's up everyone? Welcome back to the channel. This video is going to be a dupe video, and it's been a while since we've done one of those on the channel, but in my last video, which was talking about new to me eyeshadow palettes, I had a few people say that they would love to learn about any single shadow dupes I have for the very special shades in Pat McGrath's palette, specifically the Divine Rose 2, this spectacular shifty shade that she has in here. But as I was looking for shades that come close to this guy, I stumbled across a few more that I have, not for every single Pat McGrath palette that I have, but for quite a few. Not all of them are identical, but certainly worth mentioning if you want something that has a similar effect but don't necessarily want to buy a full-blown palette, and a Pat McGrath palette at that. So let's go ahead and dive in. So because this is pretty much the shadow that got us here to begin with, let's go ahead and talk about this shade. The two similar shadows I have are from Sydney Grace. The shade is called Twisted Shifter. This has a combination of a red purple, a golden taupe, an emerald green, a light kind of green. I mean, really, these are just such multifaceted shades that it's hard to describe any one particular shade that sticks out, because you turn it a little bit more and you see a new shade that you didn't see before. In my experience anyway. Then the other shadow that comes very similar is this one from Clionadh. It is the shade called Forge. Both of these very, very similar, and I feel like my camera does not do a good job at capturing what I personally see with my eyes, so hopefully in the swatches themselves you'll be able to see the nuances in these pigments. There are definitely some subtle differences, like I would say the Clionadh doesn't go quite as bold purple as, say, the Sydney Grace does, and the Pat McGrath is overall maybe a little bit less bold than either the Clionadh or the Sydney Grace, but for the most part you're going to get very, very similar shifts out of all three of these shadows. Next, let's talk about this Mothership palette. This is one of the first Mothership palette I ever bought from Pat McGrath, and I can't remember which number it is. None of these are labeled on the back, so I will annotate it here in the description box below. But the shades that I came close to in this palette are the blue purple shifty shade right here, and for that one, I have once again another Sydney Grace palette. This is the shade Beauregarde, and by comparison, it is quite a bit more boldly purple, I would say. Whereas the Pat McGrath is kind of a soft lilac-y purple that shifts into a deep violet and blue violet. Sydney Grace is more like bold grape purple and then a little bit of a navy blue and even a gold at some angles. But overall, I would say the Sydney Grace is more pigmented and more of a shadow as opposed to like a glittery over effect that the Pat McGrath is. Not that you can't like foil or use that Pat McGrath shadow wet and really layer it up, but the Sydney Grace just kind of comes that way, sort of out of the pan. The same can be said, actually identically, for a Clionadh Cosmetics shade called Spire. In the same way that the Sydney Grace is pretty solidly blue, although it kind of looks like the Clionadh is coming off more blue, whereas the Sydney Grace is purple. But when you turn them around, kind of turn them on their sides to see all of the colors that they have inside of them, it goes from a bold purple to a bold blue, and then even again like that fiery kind of golden bronzy shade on one end, and also is more of a pigment as opposed to a glittery effect like the Pat McGrath. Then the other shade that I found that was kind of close from the Pat McGrath palette is the beautiful antique gold shade in here, which is less shifty. I find that it stays pretty much looking like a green gold at all angles. It's just very intensely glittery and shimmery, kind of like that blue purple. You can totally foil it, layer it up to make it an opaque sort of wash across the lid, or you can use your finger, kind of disperse it out and make it just a glittery over effect. But the shadow that I have that comes kind of close is this one from JD Glow, and you're going to see a lot of shadows from JD Glow popping up in here because their Galaxy shadow collection is so multifaceted. I have an entire video where I swatch every shade I have for all the shadows that I have from this collection, which isn't all of them, but it's a good amount of them, more than I will talk about in this video. So if you're curious about these, I highly recommend you go check them out. But the one that I found that was closest to the Pat McGrath shade is this 365 shade. You can see it's very boldly gold on its face, but when you kind of turn it, it gets kind of even cool and pink at some angles. It's really more than just meets the eye when it comes to this gold. It's kind of, you can see it there, like pinky and iridescent at some angles. It's absolutely beautiful, a real mysterious shade. Not identical, but you get very similar effects if you're trying to replicate that. Next up, let's talk about this Mothership palette, and specifically these two shades here at the top. I have one that's kind of close to this frosty. It's like it looks like it has a white base in the pan, but then shifts intensely gold. Really, it's like a gold iridescent sparkle. It is a pretty distinctly gold chunky sparkle in there. And the one that I have that kind of comes close is this Clionadh Candela shade. It has a gold shift to it. Again, it looks kind of like a white shade with an iridescent shift to it. The major difference though is that this gold has a green hue to it, whereas the gold in the Pat McGrath palette is quite a bit more of a true like yellow gold, I would say. So not identical, but if you want a white that has an iridescent, a bold iridescent shift to it, this is a beautiful one. And Clionadh has a bunch that are kind of like this, where it's a white base and then has a colorful shift. None of them are quite as chunky and glittery as the Pat McGrath is, but similar sort of effect. Now, the other shadow that I thought would be impossible to find something similar to because it is so complex is this one here in the pan, where at some angles it is soft purple, it's pink, is it a green or a blue? It's like, it's so hard to tell, which is why I thought there's no way this is going to be anywhere else but in this palette. However, JD Glow has something for you again. This shade called Unexpected, and is one that I've talked about a few times here on the channel because it, again, is one of the standouts for me from the Galaxy collection, has a soft pinky lilac at some edges, and then you can see it goes into like a blue at some, a green at others. It too is a very complex shade. Not quite in the same way as the Pat McGrath, but as far as something that's going to come close, this is the closest I have, and it's pretty similar. Next up, let's talk about this shadow from the Divine Rose 1 palette. It is gold at some angles, it is pink at other angles, and I have to be honest, these are probably the shadows that are the farthest from being dupes just because the coloring is so much farther off, but I wanted to share them just in case you are okay with the difference in effects, because they're definitely similar, just not dupes, I wouldn't say. So I have two from JD Glow. One is AKA, this is more of a bold pink base with an intense greeny gold shift. And then the one called Sin is a softer like baby pink base with a soft, almost silver shift to it, so nowhere near as warm. In fact, I think that is the biggest difference in all the shadows, because I have one more here, which let's go ahead and mention, is one from Clionadh, and it's called Sunbeam. It too is like a soft pink base with a cool yellow or almost yellowy green sort of shift to it. And across the board, the two things that none of these shadows really come close is, one, the pinks are off. The pink in the Divine Rose 1 palette is quite a bit warmer and a little bit more muted than, say, something like this, which is a bubblegum. And the shifts that all of these have are not nearly as warm as the gold that is in the Divine Rose 1. So all of these are beautiful. All of these give you a pink base with an iridescent or highly metallic shift to them, but none of them are similar to the warmth that you're going to get from that Divine Rose 1. So those are the shadows from Pat McGrath that I could find similar singles for. I hope that if you were considering some of these Mothership palettes but just weren't sure if you'd use anything beyond the ultra unique shifty shades in here, that this helped you out. You can shop some other indie beauty brands out there to kind of get your fix. Let me know if there are any dupes I missed, any shadows that you know you have that are very similar to those unique shades from Pat McGrath. Let us know down in the comments below. Beyond that, guys, thank you so much for watching. Please don't forget to subscribe if you haven't already, and I'll catch you in the next video. Bye, guys.